things are crazy. It's chaotic. Maybe this wasn't intentional, but it was like the more cases that build up, the more I think it makes it very clear that being a journalist right now, anywhere but the United States even, it's a very scary job.
I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. Today's discussion is part of our First Amendment in the Free Press program, where we bring journalists into the community, or in this case, online, to talk about their role in democracy and their work as a reporter, editor, or producer. The program is supported in part by the Society of Professional Journalists Foundation, so many thanks to the SPJ Foundation for its support of our work. Today, I'm with Tara O'Neill, breaking news reporter for Hearst Connecticut Media Group. Tara, thanks for joining. Great to see you.
Thanks for having me. Glad I could make it.
So the last 3 to 4 months have been a challenge for all of us, but in your role as a journalist day to day, it must be specifically challenging given the circumstances. You're no longer able to go where you would like. You're no longer able to speak with sources face to face. How have you been managing?
Not too bad. It's definitely been a weird transition. I think initially we had been told that it was just going to be like a 1 week office closure, and then it turned into several months and we still haven't gone back. So I think a lot of us, myself included, leaving that newsroom that Friday, we were all just thinking, all right, we'll be back in a week. It'll just be back to normal, just 1 week of weirdness. So I think once we got the realization that it was going to be a lot longer than a week, it was really kind of figuring out ways to stay in touch with sources. Like you said, it's hard to not see people. It's hard to not, show up at police stations if I need arrest information, because a lot were just closed to the public. So it's definitely been a transition, to say the least. I think the day-to-day stuff got a bit more busier just because there was a lot more on my plate with all the coronavirus stuff going on. But I think surprisingly, the transition was not as bad as I think I was at least expecting it to be.
That's good. Well, tell us a little bit more about the day-to-day. I mean, how do you've been working from your house for the last few months? How do you keep in touch with sources? How are you able to get the information you need to report your stories when, like you said, you can't just go down to the police department and ask for records? How are you staying in touch with the people you need to source your stories?
A lot of it is cold calling people with my 914 cell phone that half of them probably haven't even seen, because I'm normally calling them from my desk phone. So a lot of it, those first few weeks, were really texting, calling, emailing a lot of my sources and just saying, hey, the way you need to reach me now is my cell phone, or email, just because, that desk phone is still sitting at my very empty desk. So that was kind of the weird transition of making sure all the people had the right way to reach me. And it really has just been me scouring social media, keeping an eye. I've got alerts for every single department now. I used to just have the major ones, but I'm just terrified to miss something because there's so much going on. It feels like almost every day. So just a lot more alerts popping up on my phone. A lot more making sure, even, knowing I'm on distribution lists for departments, but following up anyway and saying, hey, when you send out this press release, can you make sure I'm on the list? Just because, it's more than just a transition for us and the way we were doing things. It's also a transition for all these police departments and PIOs who, I don't really know all the day-to-day stuff that they're dealing with, but I've just been trying to do my best to be aware of that and try to keep myself as present as I would normally be, but from a distance.
And I should mention to those that don't know, the bulk of your reporting duties are covering law enforcement issues, specifically in Bridgeport, the Bridgeport Police Department. How have police officials been during the pandemic? Have they been willing to work with you to get you the information that you need? How have things changed, if at all, during the last few months, given the restricted access that you have?
Yeah, so I think at first it was a lot of frustration and a lot of trying to figure out who was going to be the go-to source. With Bridgeport specifically, their PIO for the police department and for the fire department isn't someone that's within the departments. It's a city official. He works in their like dispatch center, and he's the director of all emergency communications. So just trying to make sure he was still the right contact to be in touch with, and because he's kind of this in between third party already, so trying to make sure we still had the right person to go to was our first thing. And then from there, it was really being away from the radio for the Bridgeport Police Department. For years, we've had access to their encrypted channel 1 along with some of the other media in Connecticut. But unfortunately, during the pandemic, actually, the radios got shut off, citing a law that they cited when a similar situation went on about a year ago about this same time. So it's kind of been a weird situation these past few weeks of, I would have sources in other media that had access to their radio still who would send me, tips, and we wouldn't be seeing that information from the city for, an hour, hour and a half, something like that. So it's kind of losing that resource that has put things a bit on edge, I think, of trying to figure out what our next steps are for dealing with Bridgeport, because during the pandemic, especially, it's been really hard to try to get interviews with police officials just because they, like I mentioned, they've got so much on their plates too. And they only have, so much time during the day to kind of make room for things like that. So, me trying to call, I'm sure, about, a cold case or something I'm working on is very much so on their back burner. But it's, the sources that I have that are strong, it's been easy to stay in touch with. And, just last night there was some really bad gun violence in Bridgeport, and thankfully I was able to call the chief and get the information in 2 minutes. But, some nights I could call the chief and not get a call back and not get the information for 3 hours. So it's really kind of just a shot in the dark kind of thing on a day-to-day basis.
So let's go back to the issue with the radio. For those that haven't worked in newsrooms, we're talking about the police scanner, a really important tool that journalists will often use because it alerts them to any kind of police activity. So the newsroom knows what's going on, and journalists there can report on whatever the news happens to be. Really interesting story, though, dating back to about a year ago, right? Everyone in the newsroom is relying on this scanner, which is very common in newsrooms. This isn't, something that's unusual. It's very common within newsrooms. In fact, there are many citizens that are outside of newsrooms that just tune into scanners because they're curious and they want to know what's going on within their communities. Tell us what happened a year ago, the first time you had some issues regarding of a police scanner.
So we were just sitting there one day and we had a knock at our door, and it was a lieutenant with the Bridgeport Police Department who had a very short letter, and I forget what exactly it said, but basically it was, we're taking the radio back. It violates whatever the specific law was, and that was just kind of that. And it was kind of chaos of all of us not really knowing, can we say no? It's a police officer where he says he's taking it. He's got this very official letter. But very quickly, I think as soon as he was there were emails going out to, whoever needed to hear it, and calls went out, I believe, to the mayor's office. And within, an hour or two, we had sorted out that we had physically purchased the radio. So they can't come and just take it from us without our okay. The only legal outlet they have there is to just shut it off remotely from, I guess, their dispatch center. They can just turn it off. But so that is what happened about a year ago. And they said that there was a very good chance that we were going to end up losing the radio anyway. But, as things go, more important things came up that, was the furthest thing from our mind. And then maybe 2 weeks ago, we got an email from the city saying, hey, just a heads up, your radios have been turned off. So it's really just a weird situation for us. I do think, any police or fire department or ambulance broadcast is a resource for journalists, like you mentioned. It just helps us know what's going on without having to be that annoying person, calling the captain of the police department who's on scene trying to investigate a shooting. And I'm like, hey, was there really a shooting? Can you confirm that? So I think it kind of helps both sides to it. But I do know that there have been some concerns within the police department with, all the information that is shared on their channel one sometimes. Concerns about, jeopardizing investigations, what's going to get out, what's the media going to put out there that they're hearing. So I do think it was more than just, malicious. Oh, we're going to turn everyone's radio off mid-pandemic. I do think it's something that the department has wanted to do for a while. It was just the timing of it makes it tough because, I can't say, hey, let's sit down and talk about this. I can say, hey, do you want to Zoom for 20 minutes next week and explain, what's going on? But even stuff like that is kind of tough to plan.
Yeah, and I would imagine tough timing, right? I mean, we're having this national conversation about police reform, and transparency is a big part of that conversation. And one of the tools you had to provide that transparency and help your reporting, you no longer have. I've always considered the role of a police reporter in the newsroom to be one of the most difficult jobs that a journalist can have, because you really have to you really encounter these difficult situations, right, where you need to maintain relationships with your sources and those in the department, but at the same time, you're holding them accountable and you're scrutinizing their every move. What, if anything, has changed over the last few weeks as we're seeing more protests related to police misconduct and more calls for transparency measures? Has the Bridgeport Police Department, the department that you cover, have they been receptive to those calls? Has there been no change at all? What have you seen?
So I think they've been receptive. So Bridgeport's kind of been the target for a few years in terms of transparency, just dating back to May of 2017, because there was a really rough officer involved shooting of this teenager. And I think that really kind of rallied the city, rallied activists, and Bridgeport was in the spotlight and has, I think, been in the spotlight for years. And, each instance or, bad situation that would pop up, it was just, here's, the latest example of this in Bridgeport, here's what we're seeing again in Bridgeport. So it was definitely tough trying to figure out, how you write about, that transparency, but maintaining, decent relationships with people in the department. And that, I think, has probably been our toughest struggle. We've been very aware that transparency is something that the citizens are really alert to in Bridgeport. It's what the city's current mayor, it was a big driving part of his campaign, was transparency. So I think it's something that we put a lot of attention on, trying to make sure the police are maintaining that transparency. But like you said, having the radio turned off, without even a conversation that it's going to happen, for the second time now. And this, feeling a lot more intense because, how do you fight something when you can't even be in the city where it's happening? I can't show up at the mayor's door and say, hey, I want to talk, I want my radio back. So I think the timing is tough. And with so much focus on police departments being more transparent, being more open, to do something like this, it's almost like, okay, you've taken a step forward by listening to all the protesters, to meeting with, there was a group of people who were camped outside the police department for, I think, about a week it was, wanting to meet with city council and see changes. And they met with the city council, and the city council has been receptive to some of the issues they have. But it's that you took a step forward there, but then you turn off the radios and we're losing transparency there. So is that a step backwards almost? So it's just tough, and we are definitely doing what we can to make sure they are transparent, make sure we have access to resources to make them stay transparent. So I think this is definitely not, hopefully, the last you will hear from me about our radio.
and this tell us a little bit more about your relationship with the police department. I mean, it's in some ways, personal to you, given what happened a little over a year ago now, when you were arrested by the very police department that you cover. Can you tell us a little bit about that arrest and how your relationship, if at all, has been, affected, or how your work has been made more difficult, if it has, since that arrest?
In the months kind of after, it was just this weirdness of, does everyone at the department view me differently? Because, I was covering a protest from that officer involved shooting in 2017. It was the anniversary of it, and I ended up getting arrested along with a bunch of protesters while just covering the event. And I think it was kind of the idea of, well, did they arrest me because they viewed me as, being annoying fake news media who's, just in their way, or did they arrest me because it was confusing? So it was a lot of, I think, for me, just internally trying to figure out, whether I actually felt like they targeted me, whether it was just a mistake, like the city was saying it was. So for me, it was a lot of, being a little bit uncomfortable to call my police sources for a while, because I'm like, okay, well, did they think we made a big fuss about me getting arrested? Do they view it as, okay, the Connecticut Post is just trying to cause trouble for us? And I think it was just a very uncomfortable situation. I mean, I don't think I spoke to the chief directly until maybe late that summer, early that fall. It was just weirdness of, your officers arrested me, but hey, could I get a quote for this story? I think it was one of those things where, looking back, I wish I would have been more assertive about asking to meet with the sergeants who arrested me, to meet with the chief, to meet with the mayor, and just make sure that beyond it not happening to me again, just making sure it wouldn't happen in that city, at least if I had anything to say about it, by just making sure they were, trained and educated on how to deal with the media and how to very easily see if someone's wearing credentials. It's usually not, for fun. It's usually for a reason. And I think that was something that should have been done and that I definitely should have pushed harder for. But, maybe someday we'll get to have that talk. Who's to say?
And fortunately, since then, there hasn't been any other similar incident. No journalist has been arrested, though we are seeing that occur in cities across the country. Coalition of news organizations, including NEFAC. We've written letters to officials in Minnesota, New York City, Denver, places where protests following George Floyd's death were occurring frequently. And the very reporters there trying to cover those protests have been arrested, assaulted, attacked by police. I'm sure you've seen, many of the videos of these incidents as someone who's, actually been arrested herself while trying to cover a story. How did you feel? What were you thinking when you saw these videos happening, these videos from around the country?
Yeah. So it's very hard not to see it and just immediately put myself in their position, because I have, like you said, that firsthand experience of exactly what they're all experiencing. And that was such a crazy night in my life. I viewed that as like one of the worst nights I would probably have at work. So it's just kind of weird to kind of see that from an outside perspective so much, especially so many that were happening, live, of reporters having rubber bullets fired at them, CNN reporters getting arrested live on air. It was just so unnerving, and it puts me in such a weird mindset of, understanding what they're going through and also being so frustrated that it's happening, and that, it was happening live and at such an intense scale that, it just felt so much like it wasn't accidental. After, the first few, you can look at it and say, okay, things are crazy, it's chaotic, maybe this wasn't intentional. But it was like the more cases that build up, the more I think it makes it very clear that being a journalist right now, anywhere but the United States even, it's a very scary job. And, I definitely, when I got arrested, I mean, compared to all the stuff that have happened to the reporters covering these, the George Floyd protests, I feel like I got off lucky. I didn't get shot with anything. I didn't have, a projectile cause a massive bruise on me. But it's mainly though, like the emotional toll and what really stays with you. I mean, it's been over a year, and still seeing it happen to someone else can take you right back. And I imagine that's something that's not going to go away for me or any of those other reporters.
I'm sure. But meanwhile, you have a large portion of the country that's looking at reporters getting arrested and saying to themselves, "Oh, fake news. They're just being a nuisance. They're out there, spreading lies." But tell me from your perspective as a local reporter. I
Mm.
mean, what value are you really providing your community by doing all the work that you are, especially now during the pandemic, during these conversations about police reform? What would you say to those people to really help them understand the very important role that you play in our communities?
Yeah, I mainly just to please remove the whole local journalism industry from the media as a whole. I think too many people view the media and kind of clump together mainstream media, local media, just everything. They put it as, that fake news label, and anything that's news is got that label, regardless of if you're CNN or, Connecticut Post, doesn't matter. So I think it's really just, I think if people would actually read the local reporting. I mean, so many major networks are picking up details of protests from local reporters and from these local news agencies that so many people have just never heard of because they haven't taken the time to really look up local media in their area. And I feel like that's something even I'm still seeing and still remembering myself. When you read something off the wire and you see it attributed to a story, I make it a point, especially with all these protests, to go and read the local media story they're attributing from, because you're going to get something off the wire or in a really brief soundbite that's 5 seconds of a really long broadcast or a really long feature story that local media did, that's going to give you 10 times the insight what you're just seeing a snippet of. So I think it's just really seeking out local media, supporting, subscribing, and just seeing that really what we're trying to do, especially these past few months, is make sure that everyone is paying attention to what's going on and is in the know as much as we can keep them.
Can you give us a preview of anything that you're working on now? Any big stories due to come out that you can share with us?
Let's see. Yeah. So after this rough shooting we had last night in Bridgeport, it was 4 people shot, 1 killed. And then just on Monday, there were, I want to say 5 or 6 people shot and 2 people died. And they're linking it to this group violence, is the phrase they use often. It's more commonly gang violence. I think they just try to stay away from using that terminology. And so I'm just trying to do a look at how the current gangs, so to speak, in Bridgeport have been driving up gun violence just very recently, just these last couple of weeks. There's just been a string of shootings, and just the ones this week have just happened to end up fatal shootings.
Mhm.
And they say that they're targeted and people aren't cooperating. So trying to do more of a look at, well, why don't these people cooperate? If the person you're in a car with gets shot and killed, you'd think you'd want to cooperate, but it's kind of more to it than that. I'm trying to get beyond just the surface of the story and get a little bit more in depth at, the group violence and why it
Mhm.
happens, why it spikes in the summer, things like that.
Well, sounds like an incredibly important story. Thanks for breaking it. I look forward to reading it, and thank you for taking the time to join us today and talk more about your work and the role of local journalism, specifically within our communities. So important, the work you do. Thank you again. It's great talking to you, Tara.
You too. Good to see you.